Good morning. My name is Claire Bradley and I am the Director of Irish Studies here at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. Our website is genealogicalstudies.com and this is the virtual meeting for Irish Studies for May 2025 and we're recording it on the 13th of May. As always, I like to ask, does anyone have any questions or comments about any current coursework that they are taking? And there'll be a little bit of time as well at the end of the session to talk about that too, if you don't want to ask something on camera. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So I wanted to talk about myths today. Now, I don't mean that I'm going to get into Tír na nÓg and the Tuatha De Danann and Finn McCool and so on. I mean genealogical myths. And we're going to start with the biggest one of all, and that is all the records were destroyed in a fire. Now, I know that the people who are watching this video probably go, we know that already, but I wanted to take you through where it came from, because like all good myths, there is an element of truth in this one. It's just often incorrectly interpreted. I've heard it said they were all destroyed, all the records were destroyed in a fire in the Customs House, for a start. Now, the Customs House is a different building in Dublin to the Four Courts complex, which is what's in this picture here on fire. The Four Courts complex is further away from Dublin Port, and it is, as the name suggests, had held court offices, court buildings. It still does, we rebuilt it, but it also housed the Public Record Office of Ireland in the past. And during the Irish Civil War, in June 1922, it was destroyed. And quite a lot of records were lost, but they're in very specific categories. The fire that was in the Customs House, right down at the port in Dublin, was in a different year, and there was never any genealogical records held there. But people have conflated these two conflagrations in the past. So there were some things that were destroyed. So these are the main categories of things that were destroyed in the Four Courts fire. We're talking about the early Irish census returns from 1821 to 1851. The censuses were taken every 10 years on the 1 year in the decade, and the early ones were lost in this fire. The later ones, 1861 to 1891, were destroyed for different reasons. During World War I, to pulp paper, to make more paper, and also a couple of them, the 61 and 71, were destroyed for after the statistical work had been done. They just destroyed them then. So it's the early ones that were destroyed in this fire, but they were very, very important because we're talking about the oldest records that we have of many people in the country. Now, there are some fragments that remain of these censuses, and you can find them on the National Archives genealogy.nationalarchives.ie website. Now, the second category that we lost a lot of things in are Church of Ireland parish records. So the Church of Ireland was the established Church of Ireland, which meant that it was the state church. And this is despite the fact that the vast majority of people in Ireland were Catholics. So the state church meant that the records of it were public records. And that's why they started to move them. This is the tragedy. They weren't always in the Four Courts, but they moved them to the Four Courts, where 1,000 parishes approximately were destroyed in the 1922 fire. Now, a number of parishes said, hey, we can keep our records very securely in this nice room with a big padlock and it's nice and dry, and they were allowed to keep their records. So 637 parishes were saved by never having been sent to the Four Courts in the first place. And they have done a lot of work to try and find out were there any surrogates, any copies, any extracts, and they've pulled them together. And when you look at the Representative Church Body Library website, they have this lovely parish registers PDF, which gives you a list of what survived, where it is, and so on. Now, the Church of Ireland parish records that were there in 1922 don't include anything in Northern Ireland, because at that stage Northern Ireland was already partitioned. So the stuff had been moved. So the records for the parishes in Northern Ireland are in Prony. Now, they're not online, they are on microfilm in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. The third category of records that were destroyed in this fire are wills and probate records, so things to do with estates of people who have died. Now, before 1858, probate was managed by the Church of Ireland, And after that, there was a civil court of probate. And therefore, we're into the same category of Church of Ireland records being state records. And that's why the old wills were housed in the forecourts. After that, the civil court, also a state department, so also sent to the Public Records Office. Now, there are indexes that remain from before 1858 and from the period 1858 up to 1922. And there is a calendar of wills and administration for everything after 1858, which gives you a tiny summary of the value of the estate, the main person it was granted to, the name of the person who died, and so on. Again, on either genealogy.nationalarchives.ie, or if you Google Prony Wills calendar, you get the ones for Northern Ireland up there. The biggest loss in this category is for Dublin. So there were many district registries, and the main registry was in Dublin, the principal registry. And that obviously covered people who lived in Dublin, but it also covered people who were wealthy and they had property and an estate that was in more than one place. And that was lost. So all the other records, the other district repositories, there was a copy. So they made a copy and then they sent one to Dublin, and the copy was lost in Dublin, but they retained the original ones. So we have the wills for other places, but we don't have them for Dublin before 1904. The reason we have 1904 up to 1922 is because they were not yet sent to the Public Record Office. So they survived because they weren't in the building yet. Now, the good news when it comes to wills and probate is that the vast majority, well, it's not good news, but the vast majority of people in Ireland were not making wills in the 19th century because they didn't own property, or they had nothing to leave. So, it's quite likely that for the most of our ancestors, they never would have had a will in the first place for it to be destroyed. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't check. Of course, you should always check. The last category of what was destroyed was court records. And so these are court records going back many centuries, sadly, and most of what was there before the 20th century was destroyed. Now, when I try to fill gaps with these categories, I often turn to the newspapers, particularly for the latter two of these categories, because Irish people, we're quite nosy and we like to know what's going on in other people's business. So they would report on recent wills that were probated that were interesting in the newspaper, and they would almost definitely report on what was going on in the courts in the newspaper. So often your best bet for trying to plug those gaps is to turn to newspapers. So, but that's what was destroyed. But here's what wasn't destroyed, because it was never in the forecourts in the first place. And there's a huge amount of detail, as we know, in these records. We have all of the civil records, which start in 1864 for Catholic marriages, births and deaths, and 1845 for non-Catholic marriages. They were never there. We have all the Roman Catholic parish records, most of which start around the beginning of the 19th century. We have all of our land valuation records. So we've talked before about things like the Tithe Allotment books and Griffith's valuation in this session. And we also have the Registry of Deeds, again, a huge repository, which we talked about a couple of months ago in our session on the Registry of Deeds and how it's now on the full text search on Family Search. And we also have the censuses of the 20th century. At the moment, that's the 1901 and the 1911 census, which might be too late for some people if their ancestors left a long time ago from Ireland. But we also have the censuses subsequent to that. They are still to be released to the public, but they are going to be there eventually as well. There's a huge amount in this. So I really want to emphasize that this myth that everything was destroyed is just that, a complete myth. Now, my next myth is about Aran jumpers, and I know you're going to laugh about this. So I am a knitter, and as a knitter who's from Ireland, people always talk about Aran jumpers. And hand knit jumpers have been a feature of, I'm going to say, Irish tourism for nearly a century now. Kind of starts in about the 1930s. And they feature very intricate cable work, basket weave stitches, and they're often in a creamy white colour, which is known as bawneen. I picked one that's more modern for my illustration here. They're very warm too, so you see that people wearing them in the winter time. I'll often be sat here snug in the winter with one on. Now, how did this come about? Somewhere along the way, marketing people came up with the notion that there were special stitches unique to families. A bit like the way in Scotland there would be tartan that was unique to a family or a clan. Now, one of the reasons that we think this came about, and it is entirely made up, is because of a play. There's a play called Riders of the Sea by a famous Irish playwright called John Millington Synge. He also wrote the Playboy of the Western World. And in that play, spoiler alert, there's a fisherman who drowns. And his body is recognized because of dropped stitches in his socks that his sister had knit. That's a key identification piece in the play. And we think that they got the idea for this from the play, but we're not entirely sure. But whoever it was, these nameless marketers, came up with this idea, hey, maybe we could say that there were different family stitches and people would buy the jumper that goes with their name. And you do see this myth perpetuated on knitting pattern websites and all sorts of stuff, but it is absolute nonsense. Furthermore, Aran knitting was actually only introduced to Ireland about 100 years ago in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And so the Aran Islands, they're absolutely beautiful, but they've always had a marginal economic profile. And as a way to try and improve the economic status of the islands, they got women to come over from Scotland and teach them how to do this Aran knitting, with the idea that women could, and it was very largely women, could knit jumpers and then sell them to people who were visiting the islands. And this was where it all came from. So it's a complete myth that there's anything to do with families, but that should not stop you from knitting if that is so if that is your bent, or buying a lovely Aran jumper if you want one. But please do not come and tell me that you've bought the O'Flaherty Aran jumper pattern. Um, okay, this is one of my favorite myths. Um, Irish people, we love a good story, and we don't really let the truth get in the way of that. So this myth is about the Spanish Armada. And everybody in Ireland who is a bit sallow-skinned or a bit olive-complected, they get told, oh, they must be descended from the Spanish Armada. And this is rubbish, and let me explain why. First of all, who were the Spanish Armada? The Spanish Armada was a fleet of ships which were driven off course on the way home to Spain after a sea battle called Gravelines in 1588. Now, England and Spain were at war with each other, and the Spaniards sent this massive armada of ships over to do battle. Now, approximately 24, the figures vary, 24 to 28 ships were wrecked off the coast of Ireland, but like over a very large period with the whole coastline from Antrim in the north all the way down the western seaboard to Kerry in the south. So basically most of Ireland's coastline on the north and the west, we find shipwrecks from the Spanish Armada. Now, thousands of people died aboard these shipwrecks. This is a huge tragedy, and that's the first point. So those people who died on the ships did not have any babies in Ireland. They died. The second thing is the people who did survive, two things happened to them. One, they became prisoners of war of the English because Ireland was ruled by Britain, and they were executed. So they did not have time to have any babies either. Or some of them escaped. Now, some of them did escape, and they were Spanish, and they escaped to Scotland, which was a Catholic country at the time, and then they made their way back to Spain. So it's very unlikely that many of them stayed in Ireland. And, you know, Spain is famous for its lovely weather, its nice climate. Ireland, not so famous for those things. And at the time, of course, we don't have a lot of people who can go, hey, I can speak Spanish in Ireland. And many Spaniards presumably could not speak Irish, which would have been still the dominant language in the 16th century. So we're not looking at a lot of people who can communicate well with each other, and we're not looking at people who are particularly inclined to go, do you know what, this place is lovely, I'm going to stay here. So let's be generous and say that about 50 Spanish guys stayed in Ireland after the Spanish Armada wreck. And if we take an average generation being about 30 years, there's been approximately 15 generations of people since then. Now, if there were 50 guys and most of them had children, they would have thousands of descendants today, but they definitely would not be responsible for every person who was a bit sallow skinned in Ireland. And furthermore, it's not even always certain that your DNA is how you get the pigmentation of your skin. Other factors can come into that. So you can have a set of siblings and two of them can look really Italian and three of them can look like they come from Scandinavia and they can still be a full set of siblings. So you can see up here in my top right hand corner, I have taken someone who has an Irish background, and you can see that it has 2.7% Iberian ethnicity in it. This doesn't mean they're descended from the Spanish Armada. It probably doesn't mean anything at all. This is it's probably just noise. So if you do have a bit of Spanish in your ancestry and your ancestry is largely Irish, just go, oh, that's interesting, and move on. As we've said before, the ethnicity estimate is just an estimate, and you want the top level of it to be correct. So if it says that you've got 25% Chinese ancestry and you were not aware of having anybody in your family who was Chinese, well, then you need to pay attention to it. But if it broadly says that you have British Isles ancestry and that's what you expected it to have, it said, well, then you're good. All right. The last myth that I want to talk about is heraldry. Now, many people mistakenly call what is on the screen a family crest. And that's the first thing I want to do is correct the terminology. This is a coat of arms, and it can include, part of it can be a crest. Heraldry has its own special language, colours, symbolism, and so on, and it's a very detailed form of art, and it can have lots of interesting features in it that pertain to genealogy and history in general. An individual would be granted arms by the person who is in charge of this in their country, or it might be a family. And in Ireland, we had two terms for this. The first term, and you may have heard this term before, is Ulster King of Arms. Now, that's just his title, and it doesn't mean that he was a king or that he had anything to do with Ulster as opposed to the other provinces of Ireland. The Ulster King of Arms was essentially the chief herald of Ireland, and he, and he was always a man in the past, was in charge of designing arms for people and granting arms for people. And you may have seen reference to a man called Sir William Beetham on your genealogical travels. He was a famous holder of that position from 1820 to 1853. And he is noted because he made abstracts of wills and pedigrees that were later destroyed in the Four Courts fire. Another famous holder of the title was Sir Bernard Burke, who went on to found Burke's Peerage, which is a large, usually 3-volume book that holds the details of people who are aristocrats in Britain and in Ireland, which still exists today. So those men were both Ulster King of Arms. Now, after independence, it was originally intended that we wouldn't grant arms because I suppose, we were seen as an independent nation and arms are kind of a feudal concept. But it was soon found that there was still a desire for it. And there were, of course, people in Ireland who are midgerous already. And that's the adjective that we use for a family or a person who has been granted arms. They are midgerous. And so when a new generation of a family came along, they might want to add something to the coat of arms, or if they married another family who were midgerous, they might want to do what was called quartering of the arms, where they merged the arms together to create a new coat of arms for their new branch of the family. So the office of the Chief Herald of Ireland was created. Now, this is only for the counties that are today in the Republic, and the Ulster King of Arms title was merged with another heraldic office in the UK and now relates solely to Northern Ireland, the 6 counties. The Chief Herald of Ireland is based in the National Library of Ireland. I think the position is technically vacant at the moment, but one of the first holders of the title was a man called Edward MacLysaght, and you might be familiar with him because his book on surnames, the Surnames of Ireland, is still the standard work on Irish surnames. Now, here's the thing. A coat of arms is granted to a specific family, and it might be granted to their heirs as well, depending on the wording of the grant. So this one on the screen was granted to a man called Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ashmore and other descendants of his father, who was called David Ashmore, who was an attorney in Dublin. And this grant dates from the 16th of December 1853, which I got on the National Library's website. This does not mean that anybody else who's called Moore can use this coat of arms. But there are many places online and in shops in Ireland and elsewhere that will sell you all manner of artwork, jumpers, coasters, key rings, etc. with your family crest on it. And if you look carefully, you will find that there is often more than one coat of arms for a particular surname, which is a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? They were granted to different people. So this underlines the point. More than one person has a coat of arms. There's more than one Moore coat of arms, for example. There's several for O'Connor. And if you look out there, you'll see that there are different ones. So this does mean that these things are not meant to be used by people who have that surname but are not of that particular family. And you might say, what does that matter? This isn't really important. It's just a nice thing to have on the wall. And I've many times in my profession been in someone's house and they showed me something like this. And I thought, oh, I'm going to say nothing now. Not going to have a row with the nice people who've invited me to their house. But as students of genealogy, we wouldn't just grab any old Patrick Murphy's death certificate in the right place and say, that must be our guy. We'd do the homework. We'd research. We'd say, this Patrick Murphy, we've looked into him. He is our guy. Or this Patrick Murphy might be our guy, but we're not totally sure about it for these reasons. And so why wouldn't you do the same with a coat of arms? And now it may well be that some of your ancestors did have a coat of arms and that you may well be entitled to use that coat of arms, but you should do your checking. And now this, if you do find something that looks like it is relevant, well then that is something to be researched very carefully, because it will often lead to material in the genealogical office of the National Library. And the genealogical office often has details of people's ancestors as part of how they were granted their arms. And I encourage you to have a little browse on the National Library's catalogue, where they have digitized all the original grants of arms that were granted. These used to be available only on microfilm, which was very challenging, as you can imagine, a thing that has lovely colours in it, to look at it on a microfilm. But they now have digitized them all, and you can just flip through the books on their website, which is really nice to see. So if you do find something that looks right, do carefully research it, but don't just presume because you found the Bradley coat of arms that they are your arms. I found one Bradley coat of arms when I was much younger. It has ducks on it, and I thought, oh, that's very cute. But they are not my Bradleys. They're not. My Bradleys were not armigerous. I've checked that out now. So we do have a couple of minutes left for questions, but before I stop the recording, I want to thank you for coming to today's class, which was presented by the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, and you can find us at genealogicalstudies.com.